Howdy folks, it's Scanner here. Today is a Trench Crusade mystery, and I'm starting to use these every now and then to just talk about elements of the world building and the lore that I feel have big gaps because people seem to really get hung up on those gaps rather than simply waiting for the game to be developed. It's nice to discuss these things and kind of theorize and speculate as to what might be the case. So we're going to talk basically about naval stuff today. We're going to talk about the naval power of the heretics and what that might actually look like, and why I think a lot of people are wrong in their assumption as to how much of a presence the heretics have at sea. So there's a long way to go through this. So, bear with me. But one of the more established elements of Trench Crusade lore is that the bad guys essentially own the sea. Heretic fleets harry the coasts of the faithful nations. They launch endless small raids on coastal towns and cities, and occasionally they make huge efforts to take over very specific ports or areas. Ireland, Gibraltar, Rijeka, and more have all suffered brutal invasions from the sea. Sometimes they manage to win and beat the invaders, but oftentimes they lose, and it's ceding land and control and allowing ports to be taken over. One of the most notable defeats at sea by faithful forces was, of course, the loss of Admiral Nelson and his fleet, who suffered a defeat at the Battle of the Bloody Cliffs by the High Captain Ranga. A quick kind of aside here, a quick kind of thing that I realized whilst I was writing this up is that the Moving Fortress of Britannia lore states that this battle was lost due to the betrayal of Nelson by the Prince of Wales. Now, I'm not sure what the relationship is between Wales and England in French Crusade, because the Prince of Wales in the real world is an honorific for the next person in line for the throne. So I don't know if it was the next person in line for the throne who, turned coat, or if it was the literal Prince of Wales, like are the actual Welsh kind of the scumbags in this situation. I'd kind of prefer it to be the honorific one, where the actual person who turned around was the next person in line for the throne of England, because the implication there is much worse than if it was the Welsh, or just a Prince of Wales as opposed to the second in line or the next in line, because that attempt to grab full power for themselves would show the possibility of people at the very, very height, with almost everything they would want in life, being turned over essentially to the dark side. And that also came very close to bringing, England on the path to becoming a heretic domain. It's impossible to fathom if that's the case. I think it just makes the lore piece about Admiral Nelson's rearguard action, kind of like saving the day and sacrificing himself to do so, it's just so incredibly impactful. Anyway, back on track. There have been some really important developments in the timeline that have impacted how things played out at sea, and you can kind of map how they continue to impact things over time. It's really quite interesting. So in 1666, the heretics took Gibraltar, and that gave them access to Southwest Europe and Northwest Africa. The impact of this is potentially far more far-reaching than we originally considered. The designer notes around the invasion of Eire tell us that one of the reasons why the Crown of Aragon and Castile didn't intervene in the invasion, leaving much of the heavy lifting in the supply of aid and support and things like that to the French, was that they needed to keep their routes to the New World open. It seems very likely that they were never able to get their presence into the New World to the level that they would have if Gibraltar had never fallen, as the constant threat from the south would have proven to be a drain on their finances and their resources and their manpower and all that kind of stuff. So that's really interesting, because it implies a potentially very tenuous situation occurring in the New World, that it's there, it's obviously very valuable. They were willing to run the risk of having this naval base. Essentially, that's what Ireland could have turned into if it had been taken over by the heretics. kind of right up there in Northern Europe. And it's impossible to escape the idea that maybe they were okay with that because in their minds, they might have just tried to essentially leave Europe. Like, who gives a shit about Europe? The New World is right there if we can hold on to it. So it's just, I don't know, it's something to think about, something to keep in mind. So just 4 years after the fall of Gibraltar, the British were feeling the heat along their own coasts and elected to build the Fortress of the White Cliffs. So obviously those, the presence of Gibraltar was pulling forces down there, and it was opening up the northwest, basically, of Europe to all kinds of poking and prodding from the Heretic navies. So they built the Fortress of the White Cliffs in 1670. And not much is known about the Fortress of the White Cliffs. We can assume that it was either a rebuild or a massive expansion of the real-life Dover Castle. And the White Cliffs of Dover, basically, is the name of the region, so hence my assumption. The OG Dover Castle was built in the 11th century, but it's seen multiple expansions over the years via various regencies, as it's been just a consistently important tactical area pretty much since the Iron Age. So I see no reason why that would not be the case in First Crusade. 1670 was when they lost Nelson, Battle of the Bloody Cliffs, and it's kind of my personal headcanon, I guess, that the success of the Fortress of the White Cliffs inspired the moving fortress of Britannia. Were I to guess, Heretic forces probably learned ricky tick that it's very dangerous to try and invade around Dover now that the Fortress of the White Cliffs is there. They probably have a standing navy, they probably have a standing army, they can probably react pretty fast within a certain jurisdiction around it. So the Heretics learned, okay, we're going to go just kind of fuck up somewhere else, basically. We're just going to leave this alone. So they had this very effective tactic, and it left them with a very safe spot, essentially, along the coast. But it didn't have huge military value outside of that particular area, and the rest of England was getting fucked with. So this would have led to the concept of the moving fortress and how they could build that same thing, have that same element, but have it be mobile. And that would be pretty sick. So, side note here, for something that explores those kinds of themes and fantastical engineering around a project of that nature, just if you're in the mood to watch a movie and for a nice exercise in suspension of disbelief, I would suggest you watch Katsuhiro's Otomo's Steam Boy. It's his directorial follow-up after Akira, and it's really very good. It's essentially a what if engineering was magic story, and that's absolutely fine considering Akira was basically a what if science is magic story. So, once again, moving on. We sidetrack a lot in these. Very sorry. 1807 saw the Heretics invading Ireland, and they fight for a few decades, potentially close to a full century, and the Irish managed to fuck them off, basically. I've got 2 videos on this on the channel. I don't want to sidetrack too hard on it here. But it happened so quickly after the English loss at sea that it's probably not a coincidence. And the Heretics were pretty fucking confident that England couldn't or wouldn't help. Why fuck up the English Navy and then invade Ireland? Well, it's just because Ireland is smaller, and they probably would have seen Ireland as the easier win compared to invading England. If you're taking the fight off the sea, it doesn't matter if they have a fucking navy or not. And the English probably had a much larger standing army and military capability just based off geographical size and population size alone. So we also know that the Path of the Beast was active in Ireland at that time, and that would have made a very attractive, catalyst, I think, for demonic and heretical action on the island. So, 1866 sees the heretic scientists led by the demon Marbas construct the first modern submarines. Marbas is actually mentioned in the Lesser Key of Solomon and is considered to be a demon possessing great wisdom and knowledge in the mechanical arts. So he's a pretty fucking solid choice, basically, if you need help building something. Marbas is a good guy to go to, and it is a really interesting choice and a very suitable choice for this part of the lore. So 4 years later, Gibraltar once again rears its ugly head. The fact that that's lost because a submarine fleet launches from Gibraltar that destroys a bunch of merchant navies, and it plunges a lot of Europe into famine. 2 years after that, in 1872, you got the fall of Rijeka, and leading to yet another fortified heretic base that allows access to mainland Europe. Then, in 1907, the moving fortress of Britannia is completed. Some fun clues appear in that lore, basically. It is said to finally stabilize things for England. Their plan worked. The fortress can just roll up to wherever the heretics invade and curb stomp them, which is pretty groovy. They are now feeling much safer, and their claim is, and they're probably not wrong, that the existence of the fortress, while not directly going to Alba or Wales or Ireland or whatever the fuck, it does have a stabilizing effect on the, what I like to call, Hiberno-Anglo Isles. So, why does that matter? Is the big thing. Well, we also have an interesting line that the moving fortress of Britannia is the only thing that can go toe-to-toe in a one-on-one fight against behemoth-class vessels and win. So the implication there is that a 2-on-1 fight might not be a win, even with a supporting navy, which they are described to have. That 1/3 of the remaining English navy moves and travels with them as best they can anyway, because I'm assuming if needed, the fortress is going to shortcut across country and everything else will need to go around. So this gives us a little bit of insight into the true picture of the heretical naval power. Now, I'm drawing a lot of assumptions here, and you know what they say about assumptions? They make an ass out of you and me. But this is why, basically, much of the idea that the heretic navy power is that it is hard to pin down their strength of numbers, right? It's this mysterious thing. The lore indicates secret bases somewhere, with one of them thought to be on Ultimate Thule, which is Iceland. That's mentioned as a consideration of the faithful in the lore about the Irish invasion. What seems far more likely to me is that the Behemoth-class ships themselves act as a kind of a slow-moving, mobile base, and that they do a lot of their work out into the Atlantic. And that's why it's actually hard to pin them down, because they're somewhat caught between trying to supply pressure and forces and do their own logistical things into Europe, while also having to deal with the thing that's going on in the New World, right? That the Spanish essentially were so interested in. The heretics that we know, they really, really, really want the Hiberno-Anglo Isles. In real life known as the British Isles. And they're willing to really go out of their way to try and get it, to the point where they're willing to do a mass invasion of Ireland. But they're not willing to move the 2 required Behemoth-class ships in to beat the moving fortress of Britannia. We know they've lost at least 1 to it. There's no other way that they would know it can take a behemoth unless they've actually fought and it lost. So I'm assuming there was a behemoth up around, the kind of the Irish Sea, the North Atlantic, that kind of area. The fortress caught it, intercepted it, whatever, stomped it out, won. And it was like, oh, we could just send 2 to more than likely win, or we could send 3 to pretty much guarantee the victory. So why haven't they just done that? If the British Isles are so important, why haven't they done it? Well, it implies 2 things. First, they don't actually have 3 or more ships in order to guarantee the victory. They don't have them. They don't have that many Behemoth-class ships. Secondly, they do, but they can't afford to, lose a couple in the fight potentially, or have all of them damaged with serious issues, because that would mean that Europe and North Africa and the New World routes and all the rest of it wherever they're pressuring with these would start to fall out of their control. Historically, it seems that the important part of their naval victories has always come back to Gibraltar. But why is that? It's because Gibraltar is such a key known area. It would seem likely that most of their real important part of their naval victories are actually this kind of hidden network of behemoth bases, and that they can keep up a constant pressure on the faithful because of that. We've talked before and headcanoned a little bit about how the forces of hell seem bound by a kind of infernal logistical limits. It kind of takes a lot of power to open the gates of hell and move stuff across them and all that kind of stuff. They can't just move a bunch of troops because they fucked up and lost a load of them in a pointless battle at sea, or their behemoth class ship got caught and pounded out by the moving fortress of Britannia, so they just send a new one. It doesn't appear to be something that they're able to do. It appears to be a constant issue for them, is fielding the troops required to actually win these grand scale things when they decide to do them. So the timeline of Trench Crusade indicates that there's a certain cadence to the fighting, with much of it being kind of skirmish or small forces level stuff, and then a good degree of army level stuff outside of that. And then from time to time throughout history, you've got these huge incursions, these massive invasions that they try and pull off. Those big invasions are the main concern for the heretics. They can't just like shoot their fucking load before they happen, basically. One of the more fun theories that I've seen, and I'm in love with, is the idea that like massive monsters basically prowl the seas, infernal in origin, creatures like Leviathan, and that they are capable of moving massive numbers of troops around. It's very cool to think about. A massive sea monster is like moving troops around in its belly or whatever. And it's been established in the lore that the naval raiders have like tanks of gases and stuff like that keep them alive as they walk for great distances along the bottom of the sea. That would allow the creatures to drop them off well out of sight, and faithful forces finding it very difficult to track them and never actually seeing the creatures themselves. They just, after a while, there's an attack, but you've never seen a boat and you've never seen any other kind of vehicle or vessel. That would also play into my theory of hit and run tactics that have to be used in order for what isn't as big as you think it is, Heretic Navy, to keep such pressure on Europe all the time. It would allow effective use of smaller forces to cover large areas of the coast while still requiring higher headcounts from the defenders, right? Effectively doing the same thing of cutting off resources and help from the Levant and New Antioch and things of that nature. The forces of hell would technically only need to move one big monster into the earthly plane, and they just have to do it once, and then they see an almost endless return from it being there. Some sort of creature might even have just slipped through in one of the kind of reality schisms that they've hinted at or talked about or broached in many aspects of the lore. And like it also kind of leads in to the type of war that I strongly feel hell is able to fight, as opposed to the type of war I think people mistake hell as being able to fight. Like individually, elements of the damned are all about winning, but in reality, they're individually about winning, right? They want to win and still somehow have the rest of hell lose. So they almost stalemate it out, basically. They're happy to ensure suffering and supply cut off until their own internal politics decide who the next person to try something big will be. But then when that occurs, because they're on such a fucking eternal timeline, they don't care how long it takes. They sit around and they're either waiting for that other, element or demon or whomever to fail, or they're actively plotting for them to fail. Another kind of thing that I think about a lot is the fact that even right now in modern world, with all our science and all our rest of it, about 20% apparently of the ocean floor has been explored. So that's with modern tech. And the more time that I have in Trench Crusade, and people like, billionaires really obsessing over the idea of the ocean floor at points and putting like insane amounts of money into it. In Trench Crusade, the sea might as well be out of fucking space. Anything could be lurking in there and the faithful would never know. So these monsters, they certainly would make a degree of sense. I'm not guaranteeing the presence of troop carrier monsters in Trench Crusade world. I want to be very clear here. But I can't think of any argument against them, as it would make a lot of sense in the context of what we already know. I believe the Heretic naval forces are actually smaller than what we might consider them to be based on their effectiveness. They just use really good hit and run tactics very, very well. And they actually have a decent enough infrastructure to back them up. They've got some behemoth bases out in the very deep parts of the sea, out in the very abandoned parts of the sea. Remember, there's no satellite imaging or any of that kind of stuff out there. You could hide these enormous things if you wanted to, or you can have these enormous beasts burying stuff around. Something that I think actually backs that up a little bit is a consideration around the Mediterranean. So I believe it is the War Cardinal lore, they mention how the Mediterranean fleet has really worked hard to keep routes to Cyprus open, because Cyprus is like to New Antioch what New Antioch is to Europe, basically. If Cyprus goes, it'll be very hard to resupply New Antioch. So the Mediterranean fleet has kind of focused a lot there on keeping all that open. If that's so important, if you can take New Antioch by taking Cyprus, why have you not wandered in there with a large army? If Gibraltar is capable of these things, why not do it now? It's because it's not all Gibraltar, and they can't move the elements that they kind of need to enact that kind of assault into the area. So the Strait of Gibraltar is 8 miles wide. I think a Behemoth class ship is going to be fucking shite side bigger than that, right? Think about the scale of the moving fortress of Britannia. I think it's got like 10,000 troops on it, which is pretty crazy and pretty interesting. It's a big thing. So if a Behemoth can take that on, they're pretty big too. I think they'd struggle to get Behemoth class ships into the Mediterranean. The Strait of Gibraltar, as I said, it's only 8 miles wide. The Dardanelles Strait is 4 miles wide. I don't even know if the Suez Canal exists in the Trench Crusade universe. I'm choosing to assume that it does not. I don't know why I'm choosing to assume that. I just am. So they can get smaller ships in there. They can have actions coming out of Gibraltar and stuff like that. But Gibraltar is just like a small part of their obfuscated naval forces, which I believe are far more nomadic in nature. They've got these Behemoth class ships. They probably have a couple of secret things on islands in different places, things of that nature. But mostly they also need to worry about getting pounded out by faithful air power if they get too close in mass to the coasts and things of that nature. So that is like a video for another time, I think, with regards to air power. But I seem to recall it's been basically established that heretics, they kind of have the sea power, and the faithful, they kind of have the air power on their side. And there would be a lot of fucking air bases basically in and around the Mediterranean. And if you try to get too much of a massive fleet through there, they're more than likely going to spot you, and they're more than likely going to cut you up pretty hard with the old air support. So yeah, that's my reasoning. That's my thinking. I think, in essence, the Naval Raiders as a warband is like a microcosm of the Infernal Navy itself, how that actually works, that hit and run tactic, that in and out nature. I think it applies to the whole thing. I think the Heretic Navy is smaller than you think. I think it's stretched out into areas like the New World, places that we don't know anything about right now, places that much of Europe doesn't know anything about right now, and that they have a lot on their plate, and that is why, and that is what it actually looks like. So yeah, there you go. There's my theorizing. And the best part about these videos is always the comment section and people kind of sounding off their own opinions. So feel free to jump down there and say hello and let me know what you think. As always, remember to like this video only if you actually liked the video. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the little bell, and then you need to check your subscriptions feed if you want to see my videos in the future, because YouTube is not going to magically drop everything I upload into your homepage. That's just not how YouTube works. So thank you so much for watching, folks. I hope you're having a wonderful time, and all the best.